Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining our weekly podcast. I'm Robin Lewis, founder and CEO of the Robin Report, which, by the way, is much more than a daily report. Okay, we view it as really a knowledge platform from which we communicate thought leadership on various strategic topics through the daily reports, yes, but also these podcasts. And we do some webinars and hopefully in the future, some live events. And along with our chief strategist, Shelley Kohan, who, by the way, is also a professor at FIT and Syracuse University, we welcome you to our conversation on the topic of what is it about big U.S. retailers as serial failures in other countries, which is kind of a cynical title. But of course, Shelley, this theme was triggered by Nordstrom's recent announcement that they were shutting down their Canada-based stores and websites, 7 rack stores and 6 full-line stores, all of which, by the way, only really accounted for less than 3% of Nordstrom's total sales. And profitability was, quote unquote, elusive, whatever that means, and whoever said that. And of course, there was the 133 Target stores that were shuttered in 2015. But Shelley, this podcast is not just about Target and Nordstrom in Canada. We have a very special guest today who has the perfect credentials and background to answer the question why these serial failures and more on really a global scale when it involves retailing and consumer shopping behavior and their expectations along their retail journey. So we are honored to have Mark Cohen, who to most major executives in retail, he doesn't really need an introduction. But for the new kids on the block, Mark has 35 years of experience. And most notably for this podcast particularly, he was chairman and CEO of Sears Canada and more than 20 other major retailers throughout his career, where he was in president, chairman, and CEO level positions. And he is currently a professor at Columbia Business School, where he is sharing all of the knowledge he has absorbed over his 35 years in the business. And Mark, we really are honored to have you because we know you have a lot of knowledge to share with our audience today about why so many major U.S. retailers and even other international retailers create big footprints in other than their home countries, investing billions of dollars, only to discover later that the other countries' consumers apparently didn't want what they were offering. So Mark, from your truly global perspective, unwrap this very seldom understood issue, if you would please do.
Well, you know, Canada has about the same landmass as the United States. It's actually, I think, a little bit bigger. But there are only 38 million or so Canadians, while there are well over 320 million Americans. So the demographics suggests this anomaly. Large country, very few citizens. Also, you have to know that about 28% of Canada is Quebec. And Quebec is 100% French speaking and in many respects is a separate country. And about 20% of Canadians live in Quebec. So the country, from a consumer point of view, from an English speaking consumer point of view, is even smaller. And then, of course, if you travel across the Canadian cities along the 49th parallel, like Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and you walk around, you see what looks like people look just like Americans. They're wearing the same clothes, they're driving the same cars, the street signs are in English for the most part. At the end of the day, you feel like you're just in another American place. Unfortunately, their currency is worth about 25, 30% less than American currency. And their disposable is different because their taxes are different. And so, there's a whole lot of reasons why the numbers that look like no big deal just don't compute. And so when Nordstrom threw in the towel, which they did the other day, I've been asked, was I surprised? And my retort was, nope, not at all. I expected that, more or less any day, in light of, in fact, the weakness of their business in the US, which certainly casts a shadow on any ability they would have to stay the course and make their investment in Canada come out. So, they opened 6 Nordstrom stores. They happened to be in 6 locations that Sears Canada used to occupy. So I feel a little bit qualified to talk about the 6.
That's right.
When they opened them, I did have an email exchange of some consequence with Pete Nordstrom, where I said something along the lines of, Pete, I want to guess that here are 3 that I think are probably doing relatively well, in contrast to 3 that are probably struggling. And I cited Vancouver, I cited Ottawa, and I cited Yorkdale. So Vancouver is a companion city to Seattle, and there's an enormous number of Canadians who regularly cross shop down into the US, into the state of Washington. And so there, the Nordstrom brand equity would be available, apparent, and reasonably well established. And Vancouver is a sophisticated city, multi-ethnic, very large Asian population, not unlike parts of California and to some extent Seattle. Yorkdale is an upscale community northwest of downtown Toronto, which, if you're familiar with New York real estate, looks and feels a lot like the Garden State Plaza in New Jersey or Roosevelt Field. Pretty good residential population density, lots of affluence, lots of disposable, lots of sophistication. Yorkdale is the suburban bullseye, in my opinion, and always has been in the greater Toronto area. And Ottawa, which is the nation's capital, is somewhat analogous to Washington, D.C., where Nordstrom does very well. It's got a large government employee population that's stable, not subject to the vagaries of episodic layoffs, somewhat sophisticated in that regard, although there is a French connection to Ottawa, which does set it off from Washington, D.C. But I predicted those 3 would be, relatively good, and the other 3, notably Sherway Gardens, sort of a semi-upscale mall west of Toronto. Nice mall, not distinctively nice enough as Yorkdale is. And I talked about the Eaton Center, which is a dud. It's this overlarge, beautiful space in the heart of the city that has never been particularly successful for anybody who's occupied the space, because when push comes to shove, it's really nothing more than a transit hub. There's a tremendous amount of traffic that traverses the Eaton Center every day, but there aren't a lot of people who actually shop there, and there aren't a lot of people who live nearby. I live about 4 blocks from the Eaton Center, and I'm here to tell you, you don't see a lot of shopping bags relative to the amount of square footage that's devoted to retail.
Wow.
And yet Nordstrom called that out as their flagship, so they got sort of like snookered into that deal. I think they got snookered into the whole package, if you want to know the truth. Then there's Calgary. So Calgary is Canada's Houston, except it's way colder than Houston, way less sophisticated and cosmopolitan than Houston. But it is the capital of Canadian oil, and so I guess there's the connection. And the Chinook Center in Calgary is an upmarket, attractive center, but nowhere near what it would have to be for Nordstrom's to make a showing. And of course, I don't think Canadians really had a clue who Nordstrom was outside of likely Vancouver.
Interesting.
So up they go. They open the doors, lots of fanfare. They have a format that they believe is a winning format. Certainly, it has been in the United States. And Canadians are very responsive for the usual grand opening surge period, which lasts maybe 6 months, and then not so much. It's not as if Canadians are bereft with places to go for good-looking, attractive, quality apparel and accessories. They have stores like Holt Renfrew, and they have specialists like Harry Rosen, who do a pretty good job. Thank you very much. And so here we are. We survived COVID. They don't come out of COVID in particularly good shape. The rack kept the lights on at Nordstrom pre-COVID with regard to growth and profitability. And now post-COVID, if you will, the rack is struggling, and with it, Nordstrom is struggling. And they can't make sense of Canada. They can't connect the dots.
So Mark, I mean,
So how
just,
did
sorry, go ahead, Robin.
yeah, Mark? What was it Eric or Peter that you talked to?
I talked to Peter because you may recall I'd written something for the Robin Report criticizing their selection of West 57th Street.
Yeah. Right.
And so he politely objected to what I had to say. We had I don't know, 3 or 4 email exchanges of some consequence.
And that was on the New York decision.
Yeah, I mean, he pointed out how wonderful the proximity was to Central Park.
Right.
And I pointed out that the 1 or 2 city blocks between the southern boundary of Central Park and West 57th Street might as well be 10 miles. And I pointed out that Central Park may have 10 million unique footsteps. I don't know whether it was a week or a month or a year, but I pointed out that Central Park has got several dozen entries and exits. And Central Park South is not the principal portal. So we had this sort of good-natured exchange where we agreed to disagree. I was also very critical of their men's store.
He's a gentleman.
Yeah.
So and I remember the men's store as well.
Yeah.
But what was his response in your discussion about Canada? What did he say?
He didn't reveal any of the numbers, but said that I was right on with regard to the way I characterized the 6 stores.
Yeah.
Got it. Now I've been asked.
You didn't talk about the rack.
No. Well, I had been critical of the rack when we talked about New York.
Yeah.
And I've been critical of the rack. I thought the rack was a brilliant idea when they launched it as a way to sweep their markdowns off their very elegant selling floor. And then it was very successful, and so they started to feed it, like all of these outlet strategies have to do to keep their stocks, their shelves fully stocked. And then they started to open up lots of racks, and they got closer and closer to, Mother Russia Nordstrom.
Yep.
And Pete would say, and I've read this about the Nordstrom philosophy, that a young customer will, come to engage with us at the rack, and then as they grow up and they become more affluent, they'll migrate over to the Nordstrom store. And I pointed out to Pete that every time I shop the rack on 14th Street in Manhattan, I see affluent, well-dressed people buying things that they seem to be enjoying buying at deep discounts.
Yeah. Right.
And when I ask my various classes, as I do almost every semester, how many of you know the rack? They all raise their hands. How many of you know Nordstrom? They all raise their hands. And then I ask, what do you think of one versus the other? And the typical comment is, and it's typical, well, the store is beautiful and it's very elegant and it's very attractive and it's very exciting. But hey, the rack is 40 off. So I can do without the piano player and the ambiance because they've got great deals. So there you have it.
Yeah. So Mark, let's get off of Nordstrom's for just a few minutes here. Talk to me. I've heard you talk about this before, but give our audience a sense of globally, internationally, some of the big names that have tried and failed, going into other countries, which I understand there's quite a few. Can you
Well,
take it through some?
most retailers, whether they're American, Canadian, Asian, or European, who have been so bold as to cross a national border have failed. I don't know the exact statistic, but I'd be willing to bet the majority of attempts have resulted in either failure or some suboptimal outcome, which leaves everyone unhappy. Walmart is the poster boy for global failure. So
Wow.
so they succeeded in Canada. Give them credit. They took over a moribund Kmart and feeded off a failing competitor called Zellers, which eventually went out of
Right.
business. They succeeded in Mexico, where they essentially bought their way into the space and wound up getting nailed by the Justice Department to the tune of $1 billion of fines and legal fees
Yeah, I
for the
remember
50
that.
million they used.
Yeah.
They failed in the UK. They failed in Germany. They failed in Korea. They failed in Japan. They failed in Brazil. Why? Because there's an enormous amount that you can't necessarily suss out either yourself by visiting the country you intend to move into, or hiring consultants who will inform you about all the facts. And in Walmart's case, it was really egregious failure. They basically said when they bought Metro in Germany, well, we're going to open the store 7 days a week, and we're going to, bring our pricing regime to the marketplace. And somehow they missed a memo that suggested that the German government decides what hours and days you can stay open, and you're not allowed to do that on Sundays. And the German government also regulates pricing. And so, they basically got caught on, their left foot. They tried to insinuate their culture into Japan, which is in all ways you can imagine a very different culture than the US, let alone Bentonville. And so their investment in Seiyu turned out to be a real thud. And it's anybody's guess whether they'll succeed in India, where they moved in via an investment in Flipkart.
Oh, yeah.
So the jury's still out on that, but my guess is that might very well go the way. They do a lot of business in China, but most of it, I think some 70+% is in local food.
Right.
So they've been unable to bring their general merchandise mastery that they obviously have in hand in the United States into China. And so, they've had a lot of money. They spent a lot of money. They throw money around like drunken sailors, but they don't get it. And go back in history, Galleria Lafayette famously opened up a store on 57th Street in Manhattan. It failed.
Mm-hmm.
Marks and Spencer has had a variety of investments in the United States, all of which have failed. There's something about the insidiousness of language, culture, competition, and preference that is, for many, if not most, somewhat insurmountable. The retailers who succeed are typically the monobrands, especially the luxury monobrands, that have a marquee brand equity that's easy to present in a reasonably sized footprint. And they typically are successful. And then on the lower end of that monobrand scale, Starbucks has been successful, although they've had to overcome the barrier in China of consumers who don't drink coffee, and now they've started to acquire a taste for it. So it's a fool's effort for most. And I think, as I've mentioned to you before, the one shining star is Costco, which has got stores all over the world and has, to my knowledge, never stubbed their toe or failed.
Hey, Mark, let's talk about that in a second, because I think you're right, spot on with that. And I think we have some numbers that we can talk to our audience about. But when you and I were speaking the other day, you also mentioned Saks to Canada. Didn't work. That was a joke, right? We also talked about Gap to Europe and elsewhere, mostly failed. Abercrombie and Fitch to Europe, mostly failed. on and on and on. And it's true. There's just these countless number of big name failures. And Robin and I just did our podcast on the impressive turnaround of Abercrombie and Fitch in the US market. It was called Dying a Decade Ago on a Hot Rocket Back to Cool.
Yep.
But you're right, Mark. You were spot on. Guess what? The international segment, even now as they're skyrocketing up, was down low double digits last year. The EMEA was down 12% and APAC was down close to 30%. And they have 16 international stores plus the digital presence. So when we talk about these kind of international expansions, what else is going on? Why is it so difficult to be successful?
Well, the brand equity doesn't travel the way everyone would like to think it travels. Gee, doesn't everybody know Abercrombie? Well, they might have some awareness in Europe of Abercrombie, but not anything like what Americans have. Then, of course, there's the embedded, enormously challenging issue of logistics. Everything about operating in a different place brings to bear risk, challenges, peril, if you will. When you talk about Canada, the logistics of doing business in Canada is night and day different, not just because the currency is very different, because the distance between marketplaces is enormously challenging. So take Abercrombie, Mike Jeffries reached for these very high profile marquee flagship locations, which he was willing to pay any price to get. Except, as you all know, in retail, it's kind of like simple, stupid arithmetic. If your rent far exceeds the gross margin of the sales you might bring in, you've got a problem right out of the gate. And that's been an issue, certainly for Abercrombie. It was an issue to a large extent for the Gap. Think about the customer. The presumption that your brand will shoulder aside the local heroic brands just because of who you think you are is a fool's view, because it just doesn't happen. You've got to earn your stripes every day after the grand opening surge is over. And you got to bring something to bear that differentiates you, and you've got to be able to sustain it. And in many places, the competition doesn't roll over and play dead. They fight back. And they know what they're doing when they fight back. And so there you have it.
But Mark, sorry.
Yeah, the word hubris comes in very strongly here. And you think your brand is going to resonate anywhere in the world.
Right.
Well, Richard Baker had this very fanciful view that he was going to move Saks into Canada.
Yeah, I remember.
And so he moved Saks into a Cavernous Bay store on Queen Street in Toronto, which was completely wrong as a location. If he had moved Saks up to Bloor Street, which is where the action is from a luxury player point of view, Saks might have had a chance. But Queen Street, by the way, is across the street from the Eaton Center. So, just never had a chance. He also, as you probably remember, opened up a handful of Hudson Bay department stores in the Netherlands and in Belgium, which was part of a real estate deal he had done with Karstadt in Germany that involved taking over a retailer's retailer, which had been called Hema, which had been owned by De Bijenkorf. This is all backroom stuff that goes on in terms of swapping spaces. And that was an extraordinary failure. And oh, by the way, I have to add this. I didn't write this to you. When having lunch at one of the World Retail Conferences in Amsterdam a few years ago, with a table full of Amsterdammers, I said, "So what do you guys think of the HBC stores that just opened?" And they started laughing and laughing and laughing. And I knew that the store wasn't doing any business. It was a beautiful looking store, but not doing any business. And I said, "So tell me." And they said, "Well, this lunatic, Richard Baker, cut the ribbon when the store opened and pronounced the fact that the stores would undeniably be successful because the Dutch love Canadians and they love Canada." because the Canadian Army liberated Amsterdam at the end of World War II. And I'm listening to this, and then they said, well, I guess he doesn't realize that the only people who are alive who might remember that are in their 80s and they don't shop anymore.
Right, right.
Certainly not for the things that the HBC sells. So, this was another expression of hubris, faulty thinking that just fell flat on its keister.
But Mark, I have to ask you, like, seriously, you're talking about these major brands going into these countries like they didn't ever do their homework. I just don't get it, because you said
Yeah.
you weren't surprised when Nordstrom's was not successful in Canada. We have a writer that for the Rom Report, Jasmine Glasheen, she's awesome. And she said the same thing. I'm not surprised. It makes perfect sense when you consider the premium that Canadian consumers place on buying locally, which I didn't know this until I read her article, but 86% of Canadian consumers prioritize shopping at small local businesses. So I'm just confused at, what's happening. And the other thing you mentioned, Mark, I'd love for you to expand upon is you said something about Nordstrom's getting suckered into some bad real estate. Can you tell us a little bit about that too?
Well, the entry into Canada was a package deal. So they wanted to go to Canada. The Sears Canada stores were available because Eddie Lampert put everything, including the paint on the walls, up for sale. And here are the 6 preeminent locations, or among the most preeminent locations in Canada from a real estate perspective. And so they did an all-on deal, which allowed them to launch all of them at once, which at face value is kind of an efficient way to enter a market, rather than one at a time. But they're not 6 equal opportunities. And let me just harken back to these deals. The Hudson Bay Company brilliantly snookered Target into buying the entire Zellers real estate portfolio.
Yep, I remember that.
Which I was very familiar with because Hudson Bay, pre-Richard Baker, had been trying over a period of several years to convince Sears Canada to buy them. And so, I did have 2 opportunities to get deep into the weeds of their numbers. Half of those Zellers locations were on the wrong side of the tracks. They were the original Zellers stores in marketplaces across Canada that had been, when they opened, a retail bullseye. But over decades, the bullseye and the population had shifted from one quadrant of the suburban community to another. Walmart had taken over a crappy Canadian Kmart and had migrated to a different part of the city with a new Walmart Canada superstore. And so Target took over a portfolio which was half garbage.
Interesting.
Right out of the gate.
Amazing.
And they had the belief that since we're Target and we're special and we have this enormous cachet with our customer, we'll overcome that issue of location. Of course, guess what? Didn't happen. Among other mistakes they made, that was a terrible mistake. Because as we all know, when you get right down to it, it always is location, location, location when you're talking about physical retail.
So, Mark, let's go back to Costco. I know Shelley's got some numbers on that, but you had said at one point, Costco, every other country they have entered, you said they've been successful. And you mentioned why, and you said because they looked before they leapt, before they jumped in. And looked, meaning that they did their homework, right? They did their research.
Well, most retailers, especially American retailers who've jumped into China, have either retrenched or outright failed. Or if they still exist, it's in partnership with a local joint venture partner who controls and runs the business. Costco seeded their Kirkland Signature private label branded goods into China 7 years before they opened their first store. They did it by selling those goods through Alibaba and Tencent to familiarize Chinese consumers with those brands. And they also began to publicize their format, which is a subscription format, which is certainly not native to China. And so they spent 7 years doing a lot of business through third parties, enabling them to study preference and price and geography and nuance, which is a whole mouthful because China is a tremendously diverse country in every way you can imagine. And so pre-COVID, they opened a store in Shanghai and they got like 200,000 subscription applications right out of the gate. And
Unbelievable.
The day the store opened, the week the store opened, the Shanghai police had to shut down access to the neighborhood because of the enormous traffic that they drew. Now, this is an example of looking before you leap, watching closely, studying, doing your darndest to understand what you might be getting into, and then not opening 7 stores in Shanghai, but opening 1. You know, they've taken this thoughtful, careful, common sense driven approach everywhere they've expanded. And of course, they do have a format that is somewhat unique in the world. They're not the only warehouse player in the world. But why do they succeed? Because their assortments are completely differentiated in the eyes of their target customer. Their pricing is ruthlessly competitive, and they're fun to shop in. It's not a faceless, awkward place. It's an inviting place, in spite of the fact that it's a very large, oversized box with concrete floors and metal shelves.
It's like a treasure hunt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Costco, and of course, any retailer who is successful today could fail tomorrow, but look at their business as illuminated by their last quarter's results. I think they were up 6.7%, something like that. Everybody else, and this is excluding gasoline, everybody else is crying the blues. And what's Costco doing? They're just smacking the ball over the fence. And they've been doing that for years.
Shelley,
I'm a big fan of Costco.
Shelley, you got some numbers on that.
They had an incredible year. So they have 848 warehouses worldwide, 584 in the United States, and then they have some in Canada, Mexico, Japan, United Kingdom, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, Spain, etc. So 73% of the revenue is US, 14% is Canada, and 13% is other international. And here's the crazy thing, net profit. So their fiscal year runs a little different. It runs July to August. So I'm giving you numbers ending August 2022. Their profits were up 17%. Profits up 17%. Net sales were up 16%. But you know what's even more impressive when I actually dive into the numbers? When I look at their fiscal year, US up 17%, Canada up 16%, international up 10%. Bang, bang, bang. And also their membership fees are up 9%. So you have more and more memberships, in terms of, their expansions. So the renewal rate, get this, Mark and Robin, the renewal rate of membership in the US is 93%. In Canada and international, it's like 90%. Wow. It's unbelievable. And here's another number that I know Mark will appreciate. Their SG&A, so running stores and operations, was 8.8%. The year before, 9.7%, the year before, 10%. And like you said, they just posted their Q2 recently, and revenue's up like 7%, 6-7%. So it's really a tribute to how they're going about their expansions.
Yeah, and there's a lot, obviously, big lessons there to be learned by, our audience and everybody else out there. Mark, just to get into Walmart a little more here, they did fail their first attempt in China, but according to Statista, they now have approximately 10,500 stores worldwide and clubs, including clubs. under 46 banners in 24 countries, and also e-commerce. And they have now have about 400 stores in China. But it obviously was not an easy path for them. They initially entered China in 1996. They did not have enough of a localized product catering to the Chinese market. The other major factor in 1996 was consumer preferences in that market was really towards Walmart's knockoff competitor, which is Sun Art Retail Group. And Mark, as you know, 2 years later, 2 years ago, Alibaba spent, I think it was about 3.6 billion to gain a 70% share of Sun Art. So the competition is even more heated than it was back in 1996. And Sun Art uses local sourced suppliers, think Costco again, that are more in line with the target market and with the deep pockets of Alibaba. They've likely kept Walmart from gaining a larger footprint. In fact, Walmart was at 450 stores at one point, and they're now down under 40, and they're struggling to make profits.
They're down under 400.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well, you know,
anyway,
if
yeah.
Walmart is obviously, as we all know, a public company, but Walmart is not really a public company. The Walton family still has a tremendous stake,
Right.
a control stake in the business. And so if Walmart was exposed to activists, as most public companies are when they demonstrate suboptimal results, they probably would have been under tremendous pressure to pick up their toys and leave China, as many American retailers have had to do. So they're not going to do that because that would be contrary to their ethos, which is we're Walmart and we're going to be successful wherever we decide to be. Walmart doesn't have a differentiated offer to consumers. They just don't. And so trying to sell general merchandise products in China is a hopeless proposition unless they have some sort of a foothold, and they don't. And competition in China is as ruthless as it is anywhere else. And so they hire some Chinese executives and they transplant some people out of Bentonville, and they insinuate themselves as if the Chinese consumer is going to embrace them.
Yep.
And there isn't any good reason why they should. So I think they have no chance at remediating the situation they've put themselves in China. No chance, especially with regard to Alibaba's avaricious view of competition. Okay. I'd be willing to bet they're not going to be successful in India. And I think they know it, because I think after they bought Flipkart, they offered up a fairly sizable equity stake, looking for minority partners to shoulder some of their investment. So, you know, this idea that we're good, we're successful, we're big, we know what we're doing, we can travel across the globe and, you know, like Johnny Appleseed, spread our success. Just doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Well, and you know, woe to the folks that get caught up in that thinking, because they usually get killed.
Well, here was I would say this about since you mentioned China, we're talking about China, is, you know, Amazon. I mean, Amazon touches anything and it turns to gold. Guess what? Couldn't survive in China, right? And like Walmart, who also not really highly successful, certainly not profitable. They keep losing money there. They just didn't take into account the consumer market preferences and the stiff competition, notably for Amazon, Alibaba, and JD.com, which owns 80% of the market. So poor Amazon sitting there in China with less than 1%, and they end up getting out of it. So here's what it is. You said it. You know, Costco was smart. They actually partnered with online first. They partnered with the most well-known retailer there, Alibaba, Tmall, JD.com. to make Kirkland a well-known, trusted brand, and Costco, here's an idea. Instead of going up against Alibaba, like Walmart and Amazon did, Costco actually partnered with them. Brilliant, right?
Yep.
Well, Amazon was smart enough to pack up their tent before they made much of an investment. Now,
Yeah.
let me talk about India for a little bit. There was a bidding war between allegedly Walmart and Amazon for Flipkart,
Interesting.
and Amazon dropped out allegedly right at the outset, whereas Walmart jumped in and spent something like 16 or 17 billion dollars. This was a Mark Laurie led foray into e-commerce expansion. Flipkart does all of its business in English, yet only 10% of Indian consumers use English as a primary language.
Hmm.
Flipkart is all English. Amazon, on the
Hmm.
other hand, which chose not to try to buy Flipkart, has, I think, 3 different sites in 3 different indigenous languages widely used throughout India. So they're taking a much slower, more thoughtful pathway to the consumer. And of course, as you probably know, the logistics in India are absolutely bizarre in that the service and supply issues are tremendously challenging because India doesn't have the infrastructure to
Yeah.
service customers the way, of course, the US, Western Europe, and to some degree China has. So whether Flipkart succeeds or fails, my guess is not. Whether Amazon succeeds or fails, let's see what happens. And the linchpin, of course, is several months after the Flipkart deal closed, the Modi government enacted legislation which limits the ability of an international player to have principal control over a business they invest in India.
Interesting.
I'm
Hmm.
guessing
Interesting.
that Amazon knew that legislation was in the pipeline, and Walmart didn't. And then,
Yeah.
of course, to add insult to injury, the CEO of Flipkart was ejected some 6 weeks after the deal closed because of some scandal involving his personal behavior. Now, I don't know whether Amazon had a lock on to what he was or wasn't up to, but I'm pretty sure they had a pretty good idea about what kind of political platform existed in India, and therefore were necessarily being very cautious. So you got to have a brand that's got tremendous equity and differentiation. You got to have a lot of thoughtfulness behind a decision, and you've got to really take your time to study the facts. And the folks that don't die.
Well, Mark, this has been an incredible conversation. And I mean, my God, you really understand the global situation in a lot of these countries down to detail. So, and there's one thing that you said about Costco. They've never entered a foreign market and failed. And again, as I said before, you said why? Because they look before they leap. So, Mark, as usual, you cut through all of the noise to turn common sense into brilliance. And indeed, it makes us wonder how some of the best and brightest minds in the C-suites across global retailing leap before looking. So, thanks again, Mark. Being the professor you currently are, we all learned a ton today. Don't you think so, Shelley?
Absolutely. I love
Yeah.
having Mark on our show.
You get more than you asked for. So, Mark,
Well,
thanks again.
thank you for having me. And all I can say is the madness goes on.
Oh, yes. We know it well.
Mark, it's always a pleasure spending time with you. I always learn something every time I spend time with you. So that's always a great thing. For our listeners, you can find more of our podcast on Apple, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and of course, the robinreport.com. And look for us on YouTube where we broadcast our podcast as well. And make sure you follow us on social media, link in with us for the latest thoughts about the industry.
And I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And as I say every week, if you've got some idea in your mind that you would like Shelley and I to cover, please send me an email, robin@therobinreport.com. And thanks again for the barking dog in the background. Thanks, Mark.
You bet. Talk to you all soon.